There are moments when everything in us wants to hold on, to control, to prove, to protect. But what if the real shift happens when we loosen the grip? In today's episode, we explore ego, surrender, and the quiet power of simply witnessing ourselves. I'm joined by Peter Weinstein, a brilliant psychotherapist who brings both the clinical and soulful lens to what it really means to grow. Welcome to the Wiggle Room. Well, thank you for being here, Peter. It's an honor to have you here. It's kind of funny how this all came about. Julio and I were going to Janny, who is your wife's art show, a couple weekends ago to stop in, say hi. And we were having a conversation about the podcast, and the topic was love versus loyalty. And Janny kind of, showed us over to you, and the conversation just kind of naturally formed organically. And we had a really beautiful dialogue. And I said, hey, why don't you join us? And you were definitely open to it. So
Yeah.
I'm excited and grateful to have you here. Before I kind of jump in and start our conversation, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and your history?
Right. Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and Brooklyn has become one of the iconic places in the world. Um, and I had a psychotherapy practice in New York City, and then towards the end of my career, I worked in integrative medicine department at Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, doing mind-body therapies, which included hypnosis and guided visualizations and imagery. And I taught meditation and pain management and stuff like that. And I was also on the faculty of a psychoanalytic institute, which was my own orientation in my work as a therapist, but expanded it out to include other models. But that was a lovely experience as well, teaching other therapists, and it helped me to grow as a therapist as well. Until you start teaching something, um, in some ways, well, let's put it like this: it takes you to another level of mastering the material and the work. And then I guess I've always been interested in a spiritual perspective. Going back when I was a teenager, I discovered a yoga book, and it captured my imagination. And it's always something I've been engaged in at different points in my life, studying with different teachers and different traditions, and that's really informed my perspective and my work as a therapist, and particularly in the last 10 plus years, I've been particularly interested in certain forms of Buddhism. And in some ways, I think Buddha, well, first of all, maybe there was a real Buddha, a historical figure, or maybe it was a composite of a number of very wise people, because we're going back 2,500 years ago, and they had proto languages in those days. They did not have written technologies. Everything was memorized and passed on. It was the oral tradition. So, goodness, how um, uh, it came to us and how it was altered and combined. Um, and so, the story of Gautama, the Buddha, being the prince's son, and he saw sick people on the road, and it's very much folklore. Really, that's the way I look at it. And yet, the teachings themselves are about examining human nature, what makes us tick, and how we can come to a place of peace. And all the spiritual traditions are looking to provide tools, antidotes, if you will, to the kinds of suffering and discontent that we find ourselves in our lives. Life ain't easy, man.
Nah, it's not.
There's always a glitch,
Yeah.
and um, but we can't, we have to have a perspective where we also see the good things, the beautiful things in life. And so it's kind of walking that line of um, developing a perspective. And I think I've spent my life um, trying to refine that vision and um, develop a deeper understanding of myself and other people. And also, an important part of my life is being in a relationship with Jenny, and we've been together for decades. And I've learned a lot from her, and it's enhanced my life immeasurably. Um, and so, we're kind of an amalgam of different influences and events and where we grow up that create who we are. Plus, there's hard wiring, which now neuroscience is developing creating tools that they're beginning to understand brain structures and how we process information, and going all the way back to kind of, these fields of evolutionary biology and psychology. And, in some ways we're programmed to procreate, to survive, you know. Um, I don't know if it's humanoids. I'm not sure if you would call, but the early primates that are our ancestors, who were like 3 feet tall, walking in the savanna bushes of Africa, and they're looking around all the time for like the tiger jumping on their back. And we have that legacy. I mean, we are designed to be vigilant around danger, and the world has changed, but we still have brain structures which evolve so much more slowly than the changes that occur in the modern world. And so we're stuck with that. And as hopefully civilized human beings, we're trying to hold that in abeyance, because the tiger isn't necessarily jumping on our back. Although there's still challenges in life at
Sometimes it
different
might feel
times.
like that, right?
Yeah, you know. So that's who I am, and I really am happy to be here and
Yeah.
chit chat with you.
Yeah, beautifully put. There's a lot of information that you shared. We can go a ton of different ways.
Right.
Um, you mentioned the hardwiring, the programming, and when we had our initial conversation in Janny's studio, one of the first things that came up was the ego and kind of what that is and your philosophy on it. I was reading a book this morning that basically it's called Walking Each Other Home. It's by Ram Dass, and he's talking about how he's basically referring to the ego as a computer system, which I thought was kind of you kind of talked about that a little bit in your opening there. Well, I'm curious, what is your what is your thoughts on, or what is the ego, and how does it form through I guess a psychological lens or spiritual lens, or yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Right. Well, we talk about ego as if it's a sort of a concrete structure. Well, there is no ego structure in the brain. The brain is composed of other components like an amygdala or hippocampus that serve various functions. So really the ego is a kind of a concept.
Mm.
Look for an ego. You find me the ego and you'll
In the
win a
brain.
Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
Okay. So, look, we look at human behavior and you characterize it and you try to organize it. It's very conceptual. So the concept is, okay, it's some kind of unifying device or some kind of bundling together of different kinds of functions, and we call it the ego. And of course, ego has other meanings as well. So strictly speaking, psychologically, an ego is a sort of a non-material structure that helps us to organize the world and our experience of ourself. But ego also has taken on other meanings like you're on an ego trip, you're an egotist,
Yeah.
and it's more related to narcissism and things like that, but also could be related to a sense of self, and language is tricky because we sometimes ego can be characterized as self. I mean, there's a lot of different meanings around it, and ego can be pejorative, that it's a negative thing, or you have, so, it's interesting. I was thinking about that today. I'm not sure when the term ego was actually used. I'm getting into the weeds a little
No,
bit here,
yeah, please do.
but, I'm not sure if actually, it's probably a Latin word and it has a Latin meaning, but I'm wondering if Freud, he created a thing called the tripart structure. I'm getting into my teaching thing, but, you had the id, people, the id, the ego, and the superego. And he created these kinds of concepts to kind of organize how we understand human behavior. So the id was like this unconscious cauldron of bubbling impulses and desires and rage and all that stuff. And it was all outside of consciousness. And then you had the ego, which was this structure that was like the everyday mind of just remembering to go to the supermarket or to solve a problem or to control yourself, self-regulate your behavior. And then you had a superego, which was sort of like our conscience, or it was we had internal, and this is also an unconscious part of mind um, um, that made you feel bad if you did something that wasn't acceptable. Feelings of shame, but also, positive feelings as well. But it was the kind of moral compass that guided our lives that was outside of consciousness that could emerge into consciousness. And so, sort of ego, and the Freudian enterprise, if you will, was really important back in the day, and it was very influential. And intellectuals were drawn to it, and artists were drawn to it, and it was a kind of help define modern culture. Because before then, people were like, you know, looking at dreams as magical pieces of information that were descended from the gods or something, or shamans, or mind was seen in a kind of maybe mind wasn't even examined in the way that Freud did, where he clinically, as a neurologist, and then created a whole field, um, began to look at human behavior in a really different way. And then began to reorganize our understanding. So he really is, in many ways, the beginning of modern psychology. I mean, there's other movements that were more organic or physically based, but he just inspired the whole landscape, around that. So I know I'm rambling and I
No,
like
this
to
is all good
digress,
information.
but so ego, so I'm just contextualizing ego itself. So now, as in our contemporary world, ego has multiple meanings, but we generally understand what ego means is, it's I, a sense of self. I kind of lost
Yeah,
track
no,
of the
it was
question.
just what really is ego and how
Okay.
does it form? But I think you answered that way more in depth than I would
But
have
well, and,
anticipated.
and in the formation, it's really interesting because, we're the sum total of all these kinds of life experiences that we've had, teachings that we've had. We're constantly learning and absorbing information and incorporating it into a kind of a body of knowledge. We're also internalizing information unconsciously. I mean, how many times have you shifted your seat during our conversation right
Right.
now? Well, that's happening unconsciously. I mean, we have these kinds of devices like gyroscopes that are, adjusting our bodies literally in space, in time, so that we're more comfortable. You can almost say that the ego is a kind of um, non-material structure that helps us navigate the world and protects us, and allows us to have all kinds of life experiences, and then alter them and manage them and modify them that, so that they're in alignment with perhaps some kind of core unconscious values and conscious values that we've internalized. It's sort of like the driver in a car in a certain sense. But having said that, there's a lot of research around unconscious activity, and maybe we're not driving the car. Like maybe all activity is unconscious, and there's a kind of a programming like you had, Ram Dass had talked about. It's not entirely clear, really. I don't think we understand consciousness at all. I mean, there's a correlation between brain structure and consciousness, but consciousness itself is like a hologram. I mean, it's extraordinary what we can think and dream and imagine. And you see colors in your head, and you can play back stuff. I mean, that's all part of mental functioning. And is there volition? Can we really choose, or is the choice is already happening unconsciously? There's a lot of debate around that brain scientists are debating, philosophers. I mean, the aspiration to feel that we are the captain of our ship is powerful, because a sense of autonomy and a sense of control, or a sense of power that we experience when we're navigating the world, that we think we're making decisions, but maybe we're not making decisions. I don't know, but I mean, I'd like to think we are, so who knows?
No, I mean, this is fascinating. I think there's something you say, and I think I want to go there, and you say something else, and I
I
think I
know,
want
I
to go
know.
there. I'm looking for this. You see, is my book anywhere? Okay, so I'm going to read this excerpt from this book I was reading this morning, because I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. And this is from the Walking Each Other Home book with Ram Dass. It says, "The ego is a lousy master, but a wonderful servant. The art is to convert that master into a servant." Ramakrishna talked about a horse-drawn carriage with the coachman sitting on top. The horses are desires, and the coachman is ego. The coachman thinks he's handling the whole thing, but then the man inside the carriage, the awakening higher self, taps on the glass and says, "Turn left here." And the coachman says, "Who are you to tell me? What are you even doing in there?" Higher self says, "I own the carriage and you're my servant." And the ego says, "The hell you are. Like, I'm running the show. You need me to survive." It's easy to train. It's not easy to train that ego. The ego is not built on love. It's built on the fear of not surviving. And if that's who you think you are, then you're fearful all the time. And because you're fearful, you overcompensate and make decisions that further separate you from others and yourself. So I align with that thinking on the ego, which is why our conversation in the art studio was so fascinating to me, because you have different perspectives on ego. You have many perspectives on ego,
Yeah.
far more than I've ever heard in my life, which is so interesting to me. I've always associated ego with negativity. It's kind of like Ram Dass says, it's a computer system. I think when my personal belief on ego is when you're in your head, not in your heart, right? But you also said, hey Matt, like ego isn't all bad. It's healthy, right? Or it can be healthy. So I'm kind of interested to hear your perspective on that. I think one of the things you said is like it kind of organizes things for us, right? It organizes things for us. And yes, I think it does protect us from things, but sometimes I think what it protects us from is essentially keeping us away from things like love and connection with others and with ourselves.
Yeah.
So I know it's a long-winded question, but I'm just curious to hear your perspective on how the ego is healthy.
Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting that, as you were reading the metaphor that Ram Dass, wrote, you could sort of deconstruct it. There's so many different components of what he was talking about. I don't agree necessarily with all that he said. And it's interesting because that metaphor of the coachman and the wild horses, I've heard Gurdjieff use that.
Well, he mentions Gurdjieff in there where you're not. He said you can't be free from prison if you're not in. If you don't realize that you're in prison or something
Right.
along those lines.
Right. The prison of the mind. Yeah. It's both a prison and a pleasure palace.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, let me sort of backtrack. And he had the metaphor, and maybe we'll get around
Yeah.
to it. Um, because he also talked about, in some ways, if you want to expand the metaphor, the wild horses are the impulses, those deep-seated feelings of rage and lust and just unbridled feelings that are
Right.
just, are often out of control. And then you have the coachman, who's a kind of like the ego figure who's trying to control them and direct them in a positive way, getting on the road to the destination. And then you have sitting in the coach is the customer who's paying for the ride and so feels that the coachman should take him where he wants to go in that specific route. And he likened that to a kind of a higher
Awaken.
power, an awakened part of our being.
Mm-hmm.
We live in the world. We have a physical body. We have parents. We have children. We're part of a community. And, there are hermits and people who are living on the fringes. But generally, most people are in the world, working jobs, raising families, and we need to have a mind. We need to have mental structures that are adaptive and flexible and smart and effective so that we can navigate the world, so that we can make positive choices, that we can be helpful to others in our community, and that help us to tackle problems, the innumerable problems that arise on a daily basis, and problem solve, and to help us develop a kind of healthy sense of who we are, and to manage negative feelings that come up, feelings of guilt or shame or judgments and things like that. So I would say that I would see ego as being more of a kind of a structure, a non-material structure that helps us to get through life and to have a successful life. Um, and then, of course, ego is used also as a sort of a term that's more related to narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's a relationship because who we are is what we do in many ways.
So true.
And there's a part of us that wants to be loved, that wants to be recognized, that wants to be appreciated. And there's a level of wanting that and transacting in the world so you can get that that's healthy and appropriate and recognizes the value of others. And then there's a part that gets out of control and self-aggrandizes and is a bottomless pit that needs to be filled endlessly with acknowledgement. And then the person who's has that need needs it more and more, and then creates situations so that they can be worshipped or idolized or just it's all about them. And that's a big part of narcissism, that people literally serve to fulfill your needs, and you don't think about what they may need. And a big part of therapy, being a therapist, is working with people where they're out of control in that regard. I mean, you've probably know people, or you've met people who feel so um, egoistic, and all they care about is you recognizing them, and they don't give back. All they're doing is taking, 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 and they don't know how to give back. And it's just endless. We all do. We've all, but and then when it reaches a certain level, we call it pathological. And then you have like many, many books written about how do you treat someone like that. I mean, when someone is out of control, an egomaniac, how do you deal with them? And if they get a lot of power, they're really destructive. They can destroy a country, you know. And it's sad that that kind of behavior. So it's not like a schizophrenia where it's a people are hallucinating, or it's a kind of a profound organic mental illness, mania, manic depression, you know, things that bipolar. This is something that's more like a personality disorder. So a personality disorder is sort of disorders that where there's malfunctioning in context of interacting with others. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's when an ego goes awry. You know, people who grow up in who have a parent, a mother, and there's been written, you know, famous books written about that. You grow up with a mother who's a narcissist. Now, a mother and a father should be devoting themselves in an appropriate level to raising their child and teaching their child and loving their child and giving their child, you know, all kinds of things that help them to move forward in their lives. And, you know, a beautiful thing about being a parent is that it kind of keeps you in check. That kind of thirst, and we all have a thirst. We all need to be recognized and be given accolades, and you did a good job, and you're a good person, and you know that kind of stuff. But also, you have a responsibility to provide that for your child. I'm using that as an example. And so there are people who grow up with a parent who's so self-absorbed that they don't have time for their children. It damages their children. I'm just sort of riffing and
Yeah, I'm
rolling with
listening.
it. But that's an example of an ego that's destructive. You know, there's many ways it manifests. And so our journey, all of us as human beings, is to find that place, that level of functioning, that experience of ourselves that's appropriate to the situation. That we feel good enough about ourselves, that we can love ourselves and we can love other people equally. And that's a true spiritual experience. The beautiful thing about many spiritual paths, Christian path, Jewish path, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, is they all have teachings around that, and they all end up stressing the importance of helping other people. And that's an antidote to the kind of self-absorption that we all have to some degree. And we need to be self-absorbed to some level. We need to love ourselves. We need to give ourselves something. It can be out of control. And so, you know, it's said over and over again, you know, people who do volunteer work, there's a whole field. Now I'm just sort of digressing slightly. There's a whole field called positive psychology that's emerged in the last 20 years. You know, psychology and psychotherapies have always been oriented towards treating pathology. But then psychologists began to think about, well, what about exploring happiness? What about exploring how do you develop a positive experience of yourself? What are the tools? What do you need that can help you feel happier in your life. And they found that altruism and helping other people is an important resource that you have, so that you're not just thinking about your own needs or even your little circle, your tight little family, but rather, in a certain sense, we're all connected to each other. And so when I meditate, I dedicate the merit of my practice so that it benefits other people. And that's sort of an individual practice. That's in the Buddhist tradition, charity. And we give it lips. It's really hard to do, believe me. It's really hard to step out of the wagons, the circled, and you're being attacked, and to really give of yourself freely. And I think that that's something that you learn. Some households that becomes part of um, your family tradition, sort of. That's what you do. I mean, I grew up in the generation where it was like we rise together and we fall together.
Mm-hmm.
We need to create as a society a safety net. So things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid exist because there are people who just don't have the resources or the intelligence, or they're sick people. And as a society, we have a responsibility to care for them. And in caring for them, we create a better world. And the world is a nicer place to live in than a world of dividing people and every man out for himself. Fuck the other person. I only
Crazy.
care about myself. And often these are people who grew up in broken homes
Mm-hmm.
where that's all they saw was betrayal and violence. And well, they don't know about that stuff. But then, of course, we're hardwired too. Some people are just naturally more gentle or kinder. I mean, where does kindness emerge out of? Yeah, maybe it's life experience, but maybe there's some other thing going on. Why do two people who are fighting in a battle and they're sharing a foxhole, one person comes back from, when the war ends, has PTSD and is really messed up, and the other person is able to sort of compartmentalize it and move forward in their life and has been able to sort of create a kind of protective barrier, and it's not troubled by the violence that they saw. Who knows? And maybe there are people like a Ramakrishna or who was a saint in 19th century Bengal or wherever he was in India, who was became a universal figure of um, the aspiration to the divine, to experience. Who knows why? So anyway, to go all the way back, so ego can be both a tool and a curse depending on how you define it, and for some people, I mean, I've worked in my practice with narcissists, people who are egotists, and it's very, very hard to change that behavior. It goes really, really deep, and it's really, it's like breathing oxygen for them. They just have endless needs to be recognized, and and so finding that, being able to modify that behavior to some extent, and you do it maybe through self-awareness and other types of cognitive behavioral tools, where you begin to finally identify certain behaviors and you kind of deconstruct it, and you maybe can help the person put themselves in the other person's shoes. Empathy. Empathy is almost the opposite of pathological narcissism, because I think there is healthy narcissism. We need to rejoice in ourselves. We need to rejoice and, wow, it's amazing. Look what I just achieved. How wonderful. Or we have a friend who, is dealing with some medical issues, and we talk about it all the time. And, he says, every day I wake up, he shares the joy, the gratitude that, he's still, able to get around and all that. It's very inspiring. I know it's a little, but I mean, the idea of being able to rejoice in yourself is healthy, but you have to have the capacity to rejoice in others and see other people and see their value and to give them love and attention and help them. That's important. And when you're with a narcissist, you feel like it feels like a blank. You feel like you're not even recognized. I've maybe had that um, experience where it just doesn't feel good. But when you're with someone where there's, like when we were hanging out and talking, I was really curious to hear, what you had to say in your perspective. And it felt good. I felt good because I knew you felt good,
Hmm.
and even right now, as I'm talking, I'm going, oh man, Pete here is rambling. Like I love to talk, so I joke about I'm intoxicated with, myself. And so maybe there's a little bit of some narcissism around that. So I'm a little sensitive around that. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about what I was saying?
Pete, you're absolutely cooking right now. So that's what but what that means in our world is like you're on fire. You said a lot of beautiful, beautiful things. Man, there's a lot in there, and I think your perspective and how open you are is really beautiful. Because in our minds, I think we're very rigid. It's especially for me. I'm like this black and white, but I think it helps to simplify life for me. Um, and through like practicing self-awareness, I've realized like, hey man, you're not going to receive as much as you could if you look at everything black and white. Cause I think like you've just shown that there's gray area in everything, right? Which is that's been my biggest takeaway from everything that you just shared, to kind of like simplify it, is like, hey man, just because it's this doesn't mean it has to be this. It's the fascinating thing about life is that there's so many different perspectives. There's so many different perspectives. You, Janny, Julio, we could all look at one thing, like Janny's art. Janny's going to see something. You're going to see something. Julio's going to see something. I'm going to see something. And that's what kind of makes life beautiful and allows, and if you stay open, you can see Janny's perspective. I can see Peter's perspective. I can see and that allows for deeper connection with all of us. But to dive into the,
Well, can I just jump in for a
yeah,
moment?
yeah.
You talked about the gray area, and it's really interesting that you said that because I used that as a metaphor in my own work as a therapist. I would talk about that. People, some people are more rigid than others. Some people see the world in black and white ways when we understand the world. When in fact, when we're sort of transacting with people, um, there's multiple perspectives, and it's sort of and so and to explain why something happens, it's not one reason; it's stacked. There's 10 reasons underlying our behavior or the way we understand something or why someone does something or why we do something. The more that we can see, well, maybe this, and maybe this, and maybe this, and maybe that, well, that is really helpful. And also the idea that it's muddy. Life is muddy. It's murky. We strive for clarity, but given all the different elements that constitute behavior and the interaction between people, you can't reduce it down to one. And so the idea that let's be open to a lot of possibilities, I think opens up the landscape a lot. So I really appreciated what you were saying about that. I mean, just the fact that we're having this conversation and you're really curious about this stuff and we're sitting here is really, to me, it's not just talk, but you are like really um, 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 putting your money where your mouth is. And you're saying, I want to explore this stuff because I feel I'm operating in this way. And you know what? I aspire to something more, not to eliminate the other stuff, but just expand your palette, your repertoire, have a different way of understanding the world. That's incredible. I mean, most people look, life is real. And I think when we were chatting before we started, life is really challenging, got work pressures, and we don't have necessarily the luxury to sort of sit back and kind of think about, who am I? Who is this person? What's
Hmm.
going on right now? And in the big picture, what the hell does all this mean? How the hell do we end up on this sort of planet that's circling around, you know, the solar system, and they're endless, a myriad of solar systems that are out there, you know, that's expanding out, and it's the vastness of it, just the vastness of the reality of just the magnitude of the physical world is so far beyond our small brain's ability to comprehend. Or you have theories about reality, string theory, or big bangs preceding the big bang. I mean, there was Jenny was telling me a story about Einstein, was taking a bath, and he was in there for hours. And he lived at that time in Princeton, with university in New Jersey, teaching there later in his life. And he was living with his niece who was taking care of him. And he just never got out of the bathroom. So she started getting worried and was banging on the door. Are you okay? Are you okay, uncle? Or, no answer. So she called the fire department, and they broke down the door, and he was just deep in thought, a kind of contemplation, a kind of a meditative space where people who are geniuses, it's inconceivable where their minds go. And so, I mean, imagine being so deep in some kind of meditative experience about the nature of reality that you're not hearing someone banging on the door and screaming. I mean,
That's
that's like, if it's true, or maybe the story got a
it's
little distorted,
it's
but
no, it's funny because you see that in conversations you have. Like I'll joke around with my friends sometimes, and I can tell I'm talking to them and they're not there, right? They're here or they're there. So hey, did you go up the street? Did you go up the street? Let me know when you come back down the
right.
street.
The problem is that if your friends do that all the time, well, what's going on? I mean, are there things like ADHD, or
Right.
or if someone's not there, to go back to egotism and narcissism, and an unhealthy ego, where they're just not interested in what you have to say, um, and they're in a kind of another world where you're just not important. You're only
Mm.
important when you enhance their sense of self. Um,
Wow. That's crazy. I've never heard that before, but that's a really interesting perspective. Maybe that's something I should reflect on too, because I think being present is hard for a lot of people. Being present is very hard. And I catch myself maybe not being present all the time in conversations because I like to engage in dialogue like this. So if we're not engaging in dialogue like this, sometimes I may be up the street, as I say. So that's a good self-reflection for me.
but it may be coming from a different place. So once again, when we talk about like that gray area or stacking possibilities, it may not be that it's due to a kind of an unhealthy ego, but it could be to an attention span that requires a certain kind of um, stimulation. And you're
Yeah.
not trying to, it's not like you don't like the person you're with, or you don't care about them, or that you're just thinking about your own, oh man, how great I am, or whatever, or I got to move on to the next experience that enhances my experience of myself, but rather it's just, or tiredness or something like that. So we got to really kind of, and the thing is, when someone is really, really screwed up around, their ego being out of control, they're never even going to go into that place of questioning. So right off the bat, the fact that you are considering that, and that brought a kind of an association, and that's saying that's a healthy ego. What that's
Mm.
saying is, wow, maybe my friend doesn't feel good being around me in these situations, because it feels like I've checked out. And we know how it feels when someone feels checked out. You feel less than in some
Yeah.
way, even though, we could have all kinds of accomplishments, but human nature is such that we're very sensitive. We're very
Very.
sensitive people. We take snubs. I never heard this expression, being a collector of injustices. I don't know if you've ever heard that
Mm-mm.
expression.
Mm-mm.
And years of working in the field, and a patient or a client. I use the word patient because it was sort of my training was in a medical
Right.
model, but
Right.
um, he talked about his partner um, um, was a collector of injustices, and I went, "Wow, oh, that's an amazing." I had never heard that. And sadly, my patient didn't realize that he was a collector of injustices as well. And I kind of think that all people are, to different degrees, collectors of injustice, because we bruise easily. Our quote ego is fragile. There is a kind of a fragility that we all have. We want to be loved and appreciated. There's certain core needs that we have. We want to be loved and appreciated. Imagine a child growing up in a household where they don't feel loved and appreciated. How debilitating that is, how sad that is. How do you rebuild it? That's an important part of therapy. If you can even do that, I think you can over time, but it's not just talk. Years ago, Jesse Jackson, the civil rights leader, used to give talks in public schools. Maybe I'm conflating, but the spirit of what I'm saying. And he would, have the children recite everything, things like, um, "I can do it," or I believe in myself," or I'm a really good person, and something like that, to help build up a sense of self worth. When you're a poor person and maybe you ex- experiencing discrimination and or other kinds of things of that sort, well, kind of wears you down. And but I don't know that just saying it is enough. In some ways, it's sort of like you actually have to achieve something. So you try. So even as a therapist, therapists can't say, well, you're really a good person, and that's going to like make the person feel better. You have to help a person create tools and develop resources that they can move forward in their life and achieve some things. And it's the achievements that is actually the curative. That's the curative agent, is when you actually talk is cheap in some ways. It's the actual experiences that you accumulate that can transform your sense of yourself,
Mm.
your ego.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it. I think yeah, it is experience. Like you said, talk is cheap, but it's those experiences because that's where you feel, right? And that's I think when you develop the deeper understanding too, because we could talk about it all day long, but until you experience it, until you feel what it feels like to either receive that or not receive that, is when I think you develop the deeper understanding.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm just thinking of some, yeah, people, being abandoned by a parent or something. My God, how do you um, move forward from that? And you can find love in a lot of different ways. You know,
I think that's where ego, but where ego does come involved too, does come into play too, though, because that's where your sense of survivorship starts to come in play too, right? When you're in a, like for me personally speaking, like I can, both my parents were alcoholics, so I dealt with all of that, right? So it was a lot of me being able to like how to kind of raise myself in in my own way. So I had to learn how to survive at a young age and make decisions for myself at a young age, where maybe most kids didn't, right? And I think that's where ego, you start to understand. Maybe you don't understand ego, but where certain things start developing at a younger age, like you mentioned with being abandoned and and things like that.
well, addictions are the most important thing in an addict's life is getting high.
Hmm.
Sadly, you
Hmm.
know, not that they don't love their children and love their other members in their family, um, but it impacts for sure. And it's funny, you don't have the tools as a child to really put it in perspective, and yet there is a certain innate sense of at times of what you need or what's right and what's wrong, and it's not fully developed. Um, and I think the older you get, the more it gets developed. The younger you are, the more of a victim you are, because the world itself you're just flooded with information. Imagine you're 5 years old or 6 years old. Um, you've only begun to develop a certain cognitive level. Getting a sense of being in a world with other people when you're like, what, 5, 4.5? You're just sort of flooded with these things that come in, you internalize them, but nothing is organized. My God, how, how vulnerable you are. And then the older you get, you begin to develop more tools and more perspectives and more life experience. You see other families functioning. There's models that begin to you begin to become aware of, other ways of interacting with people that give you more knowledge, and then you can begin to sort of look at your own life or your own family structures and compare it to others and see, so whereas before it was like, well, something is wrong, but I just don't feel good, but it's not entirely clear what the hell's, and then you begin, well, I don't feel good, and because my mom's not there, and I look at that other family and mom is doing this with the kids, and then you begin to say, well, that's maybe the way it should be, and it's still really primitive, but that's that process of, information is so powerful and so important. We take it in unconsciously and consciously. And that, in part, um, helps us to develop the kind of tools we need to survive in the world and flourish in the world. And then, of course, there's hard wiring as well. The whole nature versus nurture argument. What's more powerful? Well, I think that they're both powerful, and it's a fool's errand to try to say one is better than the other, or one is more significant. Rather, one is more important in terms of determining how a person's life unfolds. And
Hmm.
and how do we even understand the interaction between hard wiring and life experience that keeps emerging? Um, and I really appreciate you sharing uh, um, that. We're all suffer.
Man, everybody's different, but it's we like you said. Some stories are different, but we all, like you said, we all suffer, which is true. I wanna transition a little bit into surrendering, and I think because I think that's crucial for growth in life, or the concept of surrendering, because I think it's crucial for growth in life, um, whether it's in employment, whether it's in relationship, whether it's in spirituality, because I think a lot of people correlate surrendering with giving up, which I don't think it's like that. I kind of want to get your thoughts on it. We think of it as passive, giving up, losing, collapsing. Um, what does surrender look like through your perspective?
Okay. Yeah, I've thought about surrender, and I've encountered that conceptually, and so of course, surrender sort of has a pejorative quality, generally speaking. It means you're weak, you've lost, as you said, giving up, the passivity, you know, never surrender.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like,
You hear that often.
right, never surrender. This whole macho thing,
Yeah, yeah,
which
yeah.
of course is gender free. I mean, macho.
There's some ego in that too.
Yeah, and there's some ego in that too.
Negative ego.
Right. So certainly, before I began my own explorations in the world of transformation and spirituality, surrender is, it's not a good thing, and there's a place where you surrender, in fact, isn't a good thing. So again,
The gray area.
the gray area, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. The gray area. I embrace the gray area. We're in the mud slogging, baby.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but then I began to hear about surrender in a different context, and so for me, surrender can be a beautiful thing in that you are accepting reality, which is life has ups and downs. And we all die, and hopefully death is quick, but the disease and the decrepitude is what accompanies death generally. And so in a certain sense, that's the great surrender, if you will. The great surrender, which is, I think of, I'm just going to, there's a thing in Tibetan Buddhism called the four thoughts that turn the mind. I'm kind of like, think about this. So because I suffer due to my own actions, and I now have this precious human life without knowing when I will die. I'm just bringing an excerpt around that. And so life entails suffering. I mean, there's happiness too, but generally there's different degrees of discontent or whatever. And the suffering is in relationship to the choices we make and the actions that we take. And we need to take responsibility for that. And the preciousness of human life, which is when you consider how much sperm a man produces over a lifetime and how many eggs a woman produces, when you're in a relationship, the connection of the sperm to the egg is a miracle. It's miraculous, that just that life forms, human life forms, have emerged, and then have led to other human life forms. It's a fucking miracle. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's just beyond comprehension. And we don't know when we're going to die. And that's the darn truth. We never know when that disease process emerges, out of the genetic programming of in our bodies or the environmental influences. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a lot going on in our life, and you have to learn to have a kind of psychological judo. I trained in martial arts also, but you got to roll with it. You got to roll with it, and that's what surrender means to me. Life is really complicated. It's messy. We don't know where we came from and where we're going. Really, I mean, we plan for stuff, but you never know when there's going to be like a flood or, whatever, or you know, some other event happening. And in a certain sense, so we plan, I'll get life insurance,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to put money in the bank, I'm going to save, and that's good. That's good. It's realistic. But at the end of the day, we can't control anything. We try. And so that's what surrender is surrender is acknowledging that we have to flow with life. It's like the blades of grass with a strong wind. It just sways and bounces back. The brittle tree limb snaps. You want to be a brittle tree limb, or do you want to be a blade of grass that sort of rolls with it,
Mm-hmm.
flows with it,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So in a sense, it's surrendering to the vagaries of life. And then in a spiritual context, in a certain sense, in certain traditions, in the Asian traditions, they have different culture in the East and the West do. The surrender to a guru and stuff like that, and the guru is perfect. And so also surrender has that context nowadays, I would say, since the mid 60s, with the rise of interest in Asian spiritual practices that have become part of Western society and have become, in a certain sense, it accommodated and became morphed into our own versions. And people like Byron Kelly or Ram Dass, not Byron Katie or Ram Dass or Eckhart Tolle, or all these people are out there, and they're taking it and they're just sort of changing it so it's palatable to the West.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't really quite surrender, but there are cults where people are surrendering to people. So, surrender to the guru. The guru really represents an idealized, back to the metaphor of the higher consciousness with Ram Dass and the coach, or, that cosmic consciousness, um, the Tao, the flow. I wish I was more surrendered. And when I say that, what I mean is less reactive and just more flowing and more able to just roll with it. You got to roll with it, bro.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I like to say surrendering is accepting like what isn't for you is for you.
Hmm.
Right? What isn't for you is for you.
Well, it's happening anyway. So you can either fight it, or Jenny has a phrase. She said, what was it? Hang on, or
Let go or be dragged.
Let go or be dragged. What a
Mm.
beautiful, it says it
Beautiful.
all.
I love
Let
it.
go or be dragged.
Let go or be dragged. Yeah, because I think, man, that's very nicely put, Jenny. I think that because there's tension, right? When you're, and I was watching this podcast the other day, and this woman talks about how there's a concept of we try to go through this red door, and the red door is locked, and we keep trying to force our way in this red door. But if we would just take a hairpin of a turn left, there's a yellow door that's wide open.
Right.
And that's kind of what she's saying. Let go or be dragged. There's so much tension and resistance when things aren't for us that we keep trying to force ourselves into it. And you can tell, like, intuitively, you can feel it. Like
Right.
something doesn't feel right, but whatever, maybe it's our ego that taps in and says, no, I can overcome this, or this is for me, or whatever. But it's really like the second you say, it's not for me, and you let go of that, and you be like a blade of grass, right, and just flow, it's gonna take you to where you're ultimately supposed to be.
Right.
Maybe it's like your concept. Maybe it's just living life in the gray area all the time.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
not black or white. It's just
Right.
living life in the gray area all the time. and if you can learn to practice it, it's like I say, the more you say yes to life, the more life will say yes to you.
Yeah.
You know, um, and if you just stop fighting against the tension and just let go of it, but it's so hard to practice it. It's so, and I don't know why. I don't know why it is that way. Like whether you end a relationship and there's attachment to that person, um, and you don't, maybe it's not good for you, but like you just can't let go. And maybe if you do let go of that person, there's somebody else that's waiting for you in that yellow through the other side of that yellow door. Um, but the more I practice like surrender, like in life with work, when I've maybe wanted to control things or whatever, and I just let go, it's like then maybe I've grew in my business, or I've maybe made more money, or surrendering to. I think surrendering led us to this conversation right here, right? Like went there, we're talking to Janny, and then here we are now.
Right.
It's just not being left or right. And I think when you surrender life, you open yourself up to more
Right.
possibilities.
Maybe surrender, it's so couched in sort of negative terms that it's hard for people not to have that kind of association, so that people don't turn off and they don't hear what you so aptly described is a different way of rolling, um, and and it may be there may be a cultural piece in the West where it's do, and in the East where it's sort of there was more of a kind of a cultural background. It's changing now, and again, I don't want to create caricatures because there's plenty of narcissism and greed in Asian countries as well, but there's maybe more of a cultural tradition of just sort of going with the flow kind of stuff. And so their spiritual traditions incorporated these kinds of cultural tendencies, whereas in the West it was, the what did they call it? The Protestant work ethic, and you know, or he who accumulates the most toys wins. That was an expression back in the day. Who person who had the most material advantage or most was the richest was the most successful. Well, if you want to, and to then become the richest requires maybe not flowing, but just steamrolling people. I mean, I don't know. There
Right.
are business models where they try to work with flow, particularly nowadays. Like socially responsible investment portfolios and things like that. But for the most part, the world of business and work is a kind of a violent world of you got to beat your competitor. We don't work together, and it worked. I mean, the level of material prosperity that exists in parts of the world is unparalleled. Right now, a blue collar worker is probably living better than a lord and lady in England in in the 19th century, just because of technology and things like that. But our our standard of living in the first world is unparalleled. It's unbelievable what we have. Things like running water and electricity and um, um, televisions and cell phones, and I mean it's incredible. I'm digressing a little bit, but to get back to surrender, but sort of seeing the world where we're interacting intimately with every facet of the world every day. When you get into your car, well, someone invented the car, and someone came up with ways of manufacturing the car, and there are street lights that allow you to drive on a road fairly safely because people understand, well, it's a red light, I got to stop, and now the cars are able to go in the other direction and cross you without getting into an accident. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but um, the idea that um, life is incredibly complicated, really complicated. It's amazing that we live 50, 60, 70, 80 years in a really, really amazingly complicated world. It's not like we're like bees, where they're or animals that are drawn driven instinctively to perform certain tasks, and it's all laid out because it's hardwired, and they're just sort of, but instead we have, whether it's coming volitionally or not, but man, we're in a very, very complicated world. And it creates lots and lots of anxiety. And the way we try to deal with this complicated world is to master it, to be the master of the world, our little world. And here you have now another perspective, which is, well, yeah, of course, we need to have skills, but we also need to figure out a way of appropriately letting go,
Hmm.
surrendering, having enough flexibility in our personalities to always see the big picture, which is this too shall pass.
Yeah.
So you want to either bang your head against the wall, and your head's going to break up before the wall does, unless it's inferior sheetrock or whatever. But um, and I don't think people are taught that. I mean, that would be. I mean, imagine growing up in a school system that not just didn't just teach you math and language skills and stuff, but also taught you um, tools to sort of operate in the world more effectively.
We talk about that often, about how we wish that people would have taught us these things that we're talking about right now. I talk about it with my friends who have young kids. I'm like, you have the ability to teach your kids differently than we were taught growing up. You have the ability to teach them how to surrender, how to be open, how to not close down, right? All those things, it's all done through the way you communicate with your kids and how you teach them to respond versus react. All these things, we have the ability to do it. They're the future, right? So in a way, we're kind of their foundation, and we have the ability to change it. I
Hmm.
I try to do it with my nieces and things like that. But yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective.
Well, like you see "Be Kind" signs around at the schools where they. That's a good thing. Now imagine in the schools where they taught kids the idea of, well, sometimes it's like let go or be dragged, or
Yeah, yeah,
sometimes you got to roll with it,
yeah.
and developing that kind of flexibility. But it's complicated because some people are sort of inflexible, or um, some people it's easier for them to roll with things. But I think it's sort of like a muscle. You develop it, you habituate it. The deeper perspective of understanding that things are not always going to work out the way you want it to. Um, no matter how hard you try, there's certain natural limitations. So how do you deal with that? So people who are dealt a difficult hand, um, uh, you want to fix it, and an appropriate level of fixing should be part of our toolbox, but at the same time, realizing that sometimes you just have to let go and just move on, because that's just the nature of reality.
What do you think is like a simplified way that it could be taught to somebody who maybe wants to step into that, right? Like, hey, you know that tension you're feeling? Like if you just surrender to letting that one go, like there's more peace on the other side.
Well, maybe through, like, what just popped into my head was like, body therapies, you know, working with breath. You're really agitated, you're really upset, but it's really hard. So the mind is spinning like a million miles a minute, and it ain't easy then to slow it down. Just relax, just watch your breath, allow the breath to deepen, and just feel the muscles in your body softening and letting go. So I'm sort of doing like a hypnotic.
Well,
just
I'm
a,
dropping in right now. Keep
right,
going.
right, right. No, no. But 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 I mean that's a tool where now you're suddenly realizing that's a kind of surrender.
Hmm.
So maybe, it's always about starting small,
For sure.
getting small habits, and then you build. There's books written about that. Doing small steps, taking small steps. But I also think that culture is powerful. I mean, if there were those messages, it wasn't just like on advertisements about selling products, but if there was somehow some way of creating messages of, relax, you know, sometimes things don't work out the way you want. Well, one door closes, another door opens,
Hmm.
and you begin to sort of internalize a perspective. Well, okay, let me just be flexible. People who are successful are flexible people often. They know how to pivot,
Hmm.
that kind of stuff. But again, it's easier said than done. Again, talk is cheap. How do you create a kind of an awareness? Don't always have to respond with force, let's say, or you just let it be. And I mean, let it be. The Beatles song "Let It Be" is
Let it
really an
be.
important.
It's a good song.
It's a great song,
Yeah,
and it's
really
a
good
great
song.
message. And I think that in their own way, I mean, they sort of contributed to making our culture more aware. Oh, let it be. Let it be.
Yeah, I have one more question on surrender before we switch into our last topic, and it's basically why why do you think we fear letting go of stories or people, even if they're painful or outdated?
Mysterious question, isn't it? Why do people sort of torture themselves holding on to stories and shit, holding on to relationships that are just destructive? Do you have any theories on that?
um, Man, I think it's the attachment. I think it's we know what we know,
Mm,
and we fear the unknown. Um, I think sometimes people thrive in when you're used to chaos, you find comfort in the chaos. And when there is no chaos, you're uncomfortable. And I think that comes back to the hard wiring that maybe people have had growing up or what they're used to or they're products of their environment. But ultimately, I think there's some ego in there, right? Like there's the ego is the attachment to that person. They feel, even though it may not be healthy for them, they feel some kind of sense of security
you know,
there, right? Instead of having the self awareness to realize this is not for me, and I would be better without that person, right? We know it, but maybe there's that internal tension, the resistance to surrender, to let go. I think it just goes into the whole surrender thing. It's like it's hard to surrender to where life is. You're not a blade of grass when there's emotions involved.
yeah. Also, maybe it's sort of a perspective is sort of very constricted. The idea that there's other possibilities or that there's sort of a greater world out there or that there's other opportunities, one door, another one opens. I mean, there could be the sense of, things are so complicated. And I think that what you were saying is, I think, a part of it. And there may be other dynamics in play, a sense of not deserving things, to use pop psychology kinds of things, and or a kind of a self punishment, or just a not trusting yourself and feeling
Not trusting yourself.
inadequate,
Hmm.
and so you stay with a situation because it's inconceivable that there could be other possibilities. I don't know. I never really kind of thought about it in that way. But I mean, really, what is it about? It's about, why can't people transform? Why do people stay stuck in situations? I mean, we've all been there, um, and it's I've been stuck at times in situations, and it's probably a whole menu of different pieces of it. But maybe the more important question, and an important question is how do we get unstuck? How do we cultivate a kind of emotional flexibility? And is that around developing a trust in oneself, a kind of healthy ego,
Yeah.
where you feel a kind of freedom where you can just let go of something because you know that you have the capacity to experience something better. It's like hitting the elevator button and come and keep hitting it, something like that. Um, which becomes a more positive thing. So,
I think that's the right reframe, though.
yeah, and it's a reframe. I mean, reframing is a really powerful therapeutic tool and a tool that everyone should use. Hopefully it's a correct reframing,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
really
yeah, yeah.
distorted thinking.
Yeah.
you know, but reframing is really, really great to turn lemons into lemonade.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which is there was a movie in the early '60s called Pollyanna. It was a Walt Disney movie, and it starred Haley Mills. It's really a favorite movie. It's a kids movie, and her father taught her the glad game, and so she goes to this town so her father was a missionary out in like the Pacific, in Asia, and he died, and she was taken in by um, her aunt, who was the wealthy woman who basically owned the town, and everyone worked for her. And it was a really grim place to live. It was just joyless, and people were sort of hopeless in a way. And she began to teach people the glad game, which was a kind of reframing. And what happened was, when she was living with her dad in Asia somewhere, the missionary society that he was part of sent Christmas gifts to the missionaries. And she was hoping to get a doll. Well, they didn't get a doll. Instead, the only thing they got were crutches, a bunch of crutches. And she was really disappointed. And so her dad, who was a pastor or a missionary, taught her the glad game, which was, well, you know what? You got we were given these crutches, but isn't it wonderful? You don't need to use them. And
Yeah, yeah.
she sort of taught the town how to sort of reframe and begin to see the goodness that was there in this beautiful town in the Midwest and be glad for what they had.
What an interesting way to teach, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, isn't that, we were with some friends and we were talking about despair versus hope. And I think that probably there are people who are hardwired, whatever, or they had life experience where they're in the camp of despair, where they tend to that. And there are others who tend to be more optimistic. The glass is half full. And what a blessing it is for someone who who can maintain, for the most part, the glass is half full. Man, it makes life a lot easier.
A lot easier. A lot easier. It's just, again, it goes back to what we were talking about, like all perspectives. When if you're looking at a piece of art, it's all perspective. Um, and I think if you can have that perspective of it being half full, then you're able to see things differently than it being half empty.
And then maybe there's a relationship between that and your question around why do people get stuck in some things. And, maybe there's some kind of constitutional negativity, or it could be learned, or there's just a fearfulness that exists that's sort of part of their personality structure. I mean, they've done studies where they found neonates, very, very young infants, who you could begin to see that they are more anxious than other children of that age, and that there are children of that age, who are like months old, who are more aggressive. And, how do you begin to mutate? Is that the word? No. Make more malleable that tendency towards being anxious or fearful or aggressive, so that their lives become easier, as they grow up. I mean, that's what we're talking about now. Is transformation. I mean, life is really hard. We've all been battered by stuff. We're all sort of survivors. Even people who are super rich are fucked up. Their lives are filled with suffering. They have a lot of material stuff, but emotionally, and they've even done studies on that, and they found that like a certain level of income is needed, at least in a Western society. We have basic needs, health care and some clothing and housing. And after that, it's all a wash.
Yeah.
Because then it becomes psychological, So how do we live our lives where we're happier? And that's what the Buddha, since we're sort of in the context of a spiritual thing, or other spiritual traditions talk about, how do you attain happiness? Because that's really the goal of being a human being, is to be happy and avoid pain. And that's our bottom line. And then maybe on a substrate, it's about procreation to keep the species alive. That's like the animal part of us. In the West, we have the luxury of being able to think about these things, but there are a lot of poor people in other parts of the world, including in America, who don't even have that luxury, that they're paycheck to paycheck, or living in a box on the side of the road and outside of Mumbai, or, or in Africa. And, it's funny how it keeps, we're talking about transformation, and can there even be transformation? And it's a good question if there's suffering in the world, in other parts of the world. And that's sort of idealistic and I guess a kind of a fantasy, but it's an interesting question. If someone else is suffering, can you entirely ever experience real happiness? The things of like, what is it? The stardust, and our, the profound connection that we have to the physical world that are in bodies and things like that. But nonetheless, we have a body, and we have a mind, and we're inhabiting this structure, and we are experiencing a deep desire for perpetual happiness. It's the human condition,
The human experience.
The human experience.
So I want to transition into our last section here. And there's I want to say a popular term right now in the world, doing the work. But what is it? We talk a lot about that, but what does it mean to simply just see ourselves without rushing to fix?
Well, I mean, the word rushing to fix feels pretty stressful.
Very.
And yet things have to be fixed. Got a leaky roof, got to fix it. If you're hurting, physically, you got to fix it.
Right.
If you feel someone said something hurtful to you and it wounded your feelings and you feel bad, you got to fix it. So that's the paradox and the sort of the dichotomy, or the of one hand, being in the world and having to fix things, and on the other hand, wanting to sort of not rush to fix it and let things be. And that's what I'm hearing in the question, let it be. So maybe, I guess what it is you fix things joyfully.
I like that.
So you try to cultivate a mindset that has enough space. So when you're tackling a project or there's a problem, it's more like it, you can sort out the problem and fix it in a way where at the same time you have some space around it, where you're not sucked into it, where you become really anxious and overwhelmed and reactive, but you're kind of, okay, well, yeah, we'll get it done. But in the big picture, everyone is waking up in the morning and we have enough food on the table and this is just the way life is. And seeing life as dipping in and out of fixing stuff, but, and this is a really ideal, is joyfully fixing it. If not joyfully, at least neutrally fixing it, measuredly fixing it, measuredly dealing with stuff. So how do we begin to do that? So, so one practice is I know we had talked earlier and you had mentioned awareness is what it means is you begin to sort of change your brain. I mean, your perspective, which is, okay, I have a choice. I can either tackle this thing freaked out or I can tackle it in a measured way. Well, what does that require? It requires spaciousness. So if there's anxiety in the pit of your stomach, you are not in the pit of your stomach. You are looking at the anxiety. And you're not being sucked into that vortex, but rather, okay, I'm getting stressed out about this. Holding on to perspective, this too shall pass. Things will get done. Just relax. But that's really hard to do. And that takes a lot of practice and a lot of training.
What do you think it takes to get there? Because I think for me personally, I was the person who was just like in the anxiety and I couldn't observe the anxiety. I wasn't the noticer. I wasn't the observer. And it wasn't until like I think I started with she would call herself a teacher. I wasn't.
What would you just?
She would call herself a teacher. My therapist. But she wouldn't. She doesn't call herself a therapist. She would call herself a teacher. Um, it wasn't until I think I was like, I'm tired of feeling this way, or I'm tired of my reactions making other people feel this way, that I wanted to really change. And then it wasn't until I sat down with her and she was like, you should observe this, you should observe that. But I think it took a certain kind of openness for me to go from inside myself to outside myself. And I'm just sharing my own experience.
And I really
right?
appreciate that.
I think, what do you think it takes for people who maybe aren't aware to become aware?
Too much suffering.
Yeah, I think that's what it was for me. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, when it becomes intolerable, you realize it ain't working anymore and people just surrender.
Yeah.
In a certain sense to say, I need to find a different approach. It's a lot of people never do, or it's variable. I mean, in some things we are able to make that change, and other things we're just too wedded to whatever that habituated behavior or wherever it's coming from. So so the first step is recognizing that I'm pounding on the door and the door ain't opening, and it's too painful. It ain't stopping. There's lots of different, I mean, the self-help movement has exploded and it has for like the last 50 years. So there's a lot of information out there, different kinds of information. And in a way, it's great. It's a blessing in that this stuff that exists that was never there back in the day. YouTube videos. I mean, there's so many people who have a lot of knowledge and who are really pretty evolved who are out there. That becomes a doorway. The idea that going into therapy is, for the most part, no longer stigmatized in the same way. That's a doorway. When you see a Be Kind sign up in Tucson, that it's the school system is aware that kids need. I mean, there's so many more avenues now that provide tools for transformation and change. It's incredible. It's incredible out there. So I don't know. I mean, it's just the first thing is the motivation of I need to try it a different way. And then I think they all do require a kind of shift in awareness. I mean, all behaviors come out of mind. They're ideas. Ideas generate behavior. So the idea of, well, let me try something different, or let me try this, it's really rooted in an idea. I mean, behaviors don't come out of, spontaneous. I mean, they're all come out of awareness, our conscious mind. And so that's, and then there's tons of different kinds of techniques like reframing,
Right.
or, there's a lot of stuff, meditation is a way of doing it.
I think I mean all good information. I was just curious based off of your profession, what do you usually see? And I think a lot of people do this too, and it's easy because as human beings we're hard on ourselves. So when we do something wrong, it's easy to get down on ourselves. So I think we self-criticize. But I think self-awareness is healthy. So what do you think the difference between self-criticism and self-awareness is?
Well, they're coming from different places for sure. I mean, self-criticism is like I'm using a computer metaphor. It's like a program. There's a habitual. I mean, what are the roots of self-criticism? Shame and guilt, embarrassment. I mean, these are the worst emotion that you can feel is shame, I think. Even guilt is not quite as bad. You can feel guilty and then maybe shame attaches itself, but pure, unmitigated shame is just, you want to crawl into a hole and disappear and not exist. It means guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is, I am bad.
Mm,
That's another level.
and that's hard to be with.
It's impossible to be with. So yeah, you got these powerful emotions, and how do you untangle yourself from them? So self-criticism, is rooted in a kind of an emotional construct that sort of becomes like a superstructure that's part of our sense of self and who we are. Who am I? And self-awareness is really coming from a more neutral place. I mean,
A more empathetic place to me, it almost feels like.
right. But I would even say you want to cultivate self-awareness so that it's uncritical. It's just
Mm.
aware.
Yeah,
See,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
the
yeah.
difference.
That's
So
good.
it's not tinged with emotion. It's just purely seeing things as they are,
Just an observation
an observation. I mean, that's
without
what meditation really is,
without judgment.
without judgment, no judgment at all. And dispassionately just seeing things as they are. So dispassionately seeing a certain kind of behavior or a feeling state that you have, maybe you begin to see a pattern, and then you
Mm-hmm.
go, okay, well, now I'm seeing this pattern. How can I fix it in a dispassionate way? And then there are different kinds of tools out there, but they're very, very different. They're coming from very different parts of the brain. And, you could even make a case and say that in some ways, self-awareness is the doorway to the divine, to a
Mm-hmm.
higher power or
Mm-hmm.
higher functioning, whereas self-criticism is coming really from ego, a
Mm-hmm.
broken part of the ego.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming from life experiences and so forth. So one is coming from really,
A low place.
the more problematic aspect of human functioning. The other self-awareness is coming from a part of higher level mental functioning. It's just, to be human is to be aware. And my own practice is about cultivating awareness.
I think I don't want to say it's the only place that change can happen, but I believe that's when the real change happens, when you can observe yourself from a non-emotional place and
You know,
say, I need to make a change. or I'm observing these types of patterns, and you don't have an emotional reaction to them,
Yeah.
right?
And there's always going to be emotional. I mean, the idea of like a perfect teacher, there is no perfection. We're too complicated. Our brains are too complicated, but we try to iron out most of it, a lot of it, so that we're living harmoniously within ourselves and with other people.
Why do you think it's so difficult to be with what is when it's like painful or messy?
It's a great question. I think it's about who we think we are, a kind of an identification with our sense of ourselves that have been determined by hard wiring and life experiences. So, in some ways, creating a new sense of self that incorporates the ability to connect deeply with the whole, with the flow, is sort of the antidote, so that you're sort of operating from the big picture all the time. It's really, really pretty hard to do. But I think there's some people who get there to some degree. But that's a lifetime of work and a lifetime of cultivating a kind of an awareness. So it's like meditating 24/7, but the meditation is no longer on sort of an objective or I'm meditating, but rather life is flowing around me and through me, and I'm just rolling with it. It's a really hard place to get to.
Yeah, I think it's uncomfortability, which is why it's so difficult to be with.
It's so unfamiliar.
Yeah, I had one of my one of my teachers just told me. She said, "You just gotta learn to keep your mouth shut." You just gotta learn to keep your mouth shut sometimes. Like, so when you're feeling when those feelings come in and you're feeling, it's hard for you to be with what you're feeling, because sometimes we want to yell, we want to cry, we want to run down the street and rip our shirt off or whatever, right? But it's just learning to keep your mouth shut.
It gets fully resolved because we are living in our bodies and operating with, dealing with people, and things come up and sometimes they catch us by surprise. And there is some of that kind of reactivity, but, and then you make choices in your life, who you hang out with, what you do. Life is a kind of a cleaner, less complicated life, a simpler life. So, it's a lot of factors. It's both environment, relatively undeveloped for basically all of us. And so that's where the action is around the transformation. You can't stop your mind from spinning. I had talked about the popcorn machine with the kernels popping and exploding out. But there's other parts of mental functioning that are really flowing and present and vast and undivided and uncontrived and unmanipulated and just being. And that's where we want to learn to be, or at least fluctuate between different levels of mind. Dealing with people, one level, but maybe then when that interaction is over, moving back into that other space. And then eventually they just merge into each other. But that's a really, really high level. But at least once you can conceptualize it, there's a target.
Becomes a thing. Yeah. Yeah. All right, man. Do you have one? I always ask our guests two questions. One, our podcast is called The Wiggle Room, so it's about
what's it called?
The Wiggle Room.
The Wiggle Room.
So there's a point in your life where you've ran out of wiggle room, meaning like, hey, I need to make a change, right? When it comes to, we talked about suffering and all those things, and it doesn't have to be that, but is there a point in your life where you felt like you ran out of wiggle room and you had to do something differently, and would you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had some suffering in my life, growing up, and some success as well. And I think that tons of experiences, they all come and go. Just tired of the endless experiences, both positive and negative, and wanting to find a way out of just some deeper, more sustainable peace. But I'm not in a bad space at all. I mean, I feel really hopeful, and I always have, thank God, in that regard. So it's not coming from despair or desperation. It's just knowing that there's more.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
journey is deeper and ahead of me.
And it's funny too, because I talk about this with Julio a lot, and it's like, the more you come to this other side, it's like you can never go back over to the other side. And then the more you think, it's like, oh, I just got to clean up aisle 2 and aisle 3. You're like, oh shit, I got to clean up the whole store, and that can kind of be disappointing sometimes, but it can also be exciting because you're like, you know, damn, there's a lot more to do here than I thought there was. And it can
Yeah,
feel overwhelming.
I'm glad you said that, because why even preclude anything? Who the hell knows? Every day is a new adventure. You never know what the hell's going to happen that changes the trajectory. You got to be open to it. But, we're humans. And so being open to new things, as you said earlier, is not something that most humans are comfortable with, or so we'll see, around that.
Last question, if there was one piece of wisdom that you could give to the world about your life and your work, what would it be?
I think the two great things in my life has been um, being in a relationship with someone that has been beautiful for both of us. That's really a great achievement. More so than work and occupation and all that. And actually, work and is less important. And the other one is that I believe that there's a beauty in the world, that there's something magnificent in being alive and having a brain and an awareness, and that awareness offers the possibility of experiencing deep peace
Mm.
and wisdom.